And we are live. Welcome back to the channel, Sandy Golston TV, specializing in BookTube and AuthorTube content. I'm just looking forward to just kind of kicking it today and just having some fun getting back into writing. I haven't really done a lot of writing and definitely haven't done a lot of YouTube lives recently. Just been busy with a lot of stuff. So I think everybody can relate to that in one way or another. It's just kind of how it goes. So I'm just going to get on here today, and I don't know how long I'll be on here, probably an hour, hour and a half. We'll see how things go. But I really want to work on getting some writing in. So been a good morning already. Didn't sleep very well last night, but that's, how it goes sometimes. I fell asleep too early, and then I ended up waking up in the middle of the night. So that's just, again, kind of how things sometimes go. So I am going to work on a story that I've been developing. I'm at about 10,000, a little over 10,000 words into it. And initially it was going to be I guess it was going to be basically a fan fiction story. And I decided to scrap the fan fiction and just turn it into an original story. So I'm going to have fun with it and just see where it goes. I started it and I just cranked out like 5,000 words, like really fast. And that was a lot of fun. And then, once you get past like a few thousand words, it's pretty difficult to just, just bring it down. It's just kind of hard after that because you just feel like, man, I've just invested so much time into it that, you just want to see it to the end. So that's kind of where I am with that particular project. Now, from a reading standpoint, this is what I'm reading right now, Concrete Rose by Angie Thomas. So this is the book that I'm into right now. And this, of course, if you guys remember The Hate You Give, also by Angie Thomas. This is a prequel to it. And you can see I'm probably about a little over halfway through it. I think I'm at 56% according to Goodreads, which is pretty good progress. I feel like I should have this done. If not today, Saturday, then probably Sunday for sure. That'll give me an opportunity to hopefully squeeze in another couple books before the end of the month. I am right now at 6 books read for the month of January, which is pretty good. So that's actually 6 is probably pretty close to average of what I did last year. I got off to a great start. I read like probably four of them in the first probably week of January. Then I kind of stalled a little bit on a couple readings. And I've kind of stalled a little bit on Concrete Rose, just not because it's not really good, because it is good. I've actually really enjoyed it. Kind of gives you an insight into, which I'm a little bit more familiar with growing up in an urban atmosphere, growing up Black in an urban atmosphere, and just some of the things that go with it. Not that I can relate to a lot of the stuff that happens in there, but I think, just from things that you've seen with other people, at least I can relate. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get into some writing here, and let me get everything set up. As you can see, I'm using multiple computers here again today, and hope everybody's having a good start to their weekend. Hopefully, I know it's just Saturday morning, but hopefully you had a good Friday to get your weekend started. Let me go ahead, because my computer pulled a little bit of a fast one on me last night, and it decided to update. So it closed everything out, but that's all good. So, all right, I got set up what I want to have set up. I got my stories open here, and I'm actually experimenting with some different writing software. I use Microsoft Word largely. I do sometimes use Google Docs, and I did purchase, I should say, Scrivener a few years ago. Just had trouble getting into Scrivener, so I'm not sure if that's something that I'm going to eventually start using a little bit more, but I do have it as a resource. And then the other one that I've been looking at lately that a lot of people have been talking about is this application called Campfire. So I'm going to look into Campfire and see if that's something that I want to maybe use a little bit more in the future. So just checking that one out and seeing where I want to go with that one. If that's something that I want to stick with, or I should say stick with, if that's something I want to try and then eventually stick with, then we'll see. It's got a one-time purchase price, which is actually pretty fine, pretty attractive. So I might end up going with that. Okay, let me go ahead and get the clock up on the screen. I have to go super full screen here and share my screen with y'all. Here we go. And so you got the clock there. I'm going to go ahead and hit start, and I'm going to get going with this first writing sprint. Here we go. All right, and let me go ahead and tally up here. Let's see what I got here for this first writing sprint. I All right, hang on a second. Okay, so I got in 274 words of writing, which is pretty good. I was multitasking, doing a few things, so that was pretty fine. I'm at still a pretty early stage in this story that I'm writing, relatively early. So just to let you guys know here, let me do a full word count here real quick. Hang on. Sometimes I put, well, all the time, I put notes at the end of the story that help guide me. I should be using, platforms like Scrivener or whatever to help me organize things a little bit better. Okay. So I have, for this project, I have 10,822 words total for this particular project. So let me write that down for y'all. I don't anticipate this being a super long story. It's probably going to be probably maybe in the 50,000 word range. I don't like to blow a story up too much in terms of trying to drag it out to a certain word count. So if it's meant to be 50,000 words, then it's just meant to be 50,000 words. You don't have to necessarily try to make it into 80,000 words, which is sometimes what I've done in the past with certain stories, and probably what a lot of writers do with certain stories. Like if you have watched a lot of my wrap up videos for the month, my monthly wrap up videos, you probably see that one of the criticisms that I probably most have of a lot of books is that it's probably longer than it should be. That's pretty a typical sentiment for me, because a lot of times it just kind of drags on certain stories, and you just are just kind of like, okay, I'm ready to just just kind of tap out a little bit. So that's usually one of my criticisms. So this one will probably end up being, I'd say, probably in the 50,000 range. I don't anticipate it being much above that. So hope everybody's doing okay. It sounds like Nicole is with us, and she's working on a poetry collection for April. And she says outlining a few novels, which is cool. I am working on an outline as well. I think some of you who have been following the live streams, you've heard me talk about this dystopian series that I'm working on, and I wanted to jump into it right away, and then I stopped because I wanted to outline it a little bit more, and I was looking at some information about world building, because this is one of the few books I've written that has significant world building that's going to be essential to the story. And so I was actually watching a lecture by Brandon Sanderson, who's an author that I want to read a little bit more this year, and he was talking about world building. So I'm going to study up on that a little bit more, and I just want to make sure I've got at least the principles of it down pretty cold before I really jump into it as much as I want to, because it's just going to be a lot of fun to do this story. It's very different than anything I've ever done before, and I want to make sure that I nail it and get it right, because the trend for a lot of people who are writing these days, and for what people are reading, which obviously go hand in hand, is that people are doing series. And so I am looking forward to getting this series going. I do have a series going right now, but they're individual stories with a common character. So I'm going to keep that series going as well. And it's a cool, because the main character is a woman of color, and I haven't had very many women of color as a main character in a story. So I'm really excited about this, not only story, but series of stories that I think is going to be cool. Mainly because she's in journalism, which is where I started professionally in terms of my career. So I'm excited about that one and keeping that one going. Let's see. Let's see what the people are saying here. Nazy, welcome, my friend. Let's see, jumped in near the end of the sprint, managed to squeeze in some editing. Excellent, excellent. Yeah, I mean that's what a lot of it is for. It's just a time to focus and chat and get our little community going and have some fun with it. So it's yeah, it's a cool thing. I am probably going to do some editing in some of these sprints down the line to work on some projects. I have my NaNoWriMo project that I've kind of been letting marinate for a little while, and then I'm going to eventually come back to that at some point and start some editing with that particular piece. So great to have you here with us. What story structure do you prefer? I usually write the 3-act format for my stories. It just it's pretty simple in concept, and yet it can be complex in that there's so many aspects to it. If you look at some 3-act structure maps, it can get really, really deep, and yet it can be really simple and help you keep you on track. Because in essence, it's really simple, but you can add elements to it to make it even more complex if that's something that you're looking for, depending on the kind of story that you're putting together. So that's typically what I go for in terms of writing structure. Okay, let me go ahead and get the clock set up for writing sprint number 2. Go ahead and put the clock back up on the screen. And again, whatever you guys are doing, if you guys are reading, if you guys are writing, if you're editing, if you're outlining, these are all things that I personally have done during these sprints just to, because it's just a matter of where you are with a particular story. Sometimes if I stall during a story, then I'll just go to some editing in another story, or I'll go to some outlining of another story. There's just lots of different things that you can do. Or you go to reading. As I said earlier, this is the book I'm reading, Concrete Rose by Angie Thomas. So I'm pretty close to about halfway done. I think I'm about 56% done with this particular story. So that's the book that I'm actually reading right now. And it's pretty good. I read The Hate You Give, really liked it. And so I was looking forward to this. I thought it would be kind of an interesting story to actually check out. So I'll let you guys know. That'll be in my wrap-up video for the month of January 2021. All right, let me see. Let me go ahead and get the clock back up here. So if you guys are by your computers or you got a pen and paper, whatever you do, however you do it, go ahead and get started as I'm going to hit the clock right now. And we're at a little past, at 3 past the hour. So take us to about 11:18 here, at least those of us on the East Coast time. So that's what we're going to do. Okay, so that's 311 words for me during that sprint. Let me throw that up there right now, just to give you guys an idea of where I was during that particular sprint. So 311 words, which is pretty good. Some of it is dialogue and just setting the scene. One of the things that I'm going to have to do with this particular story, because it is a horror story, and I've never really written horror before, but I was doing some research. And so if you look at my Goodreads books for the month of January, I studied some horror books because I wanted to get a feel for how they start off, how they play out, how things work in horror stories. And so I feel like I did myself a pretty good service with that. But one of the things I'm going to probably end up having to do is I'm going to have to probably put a like a prologue type chapter in. The problem is that a lot of people don't read prologue; they usually skip past it. So what I may have to do is just do like a God, why is the phrase slipping my mind? Um, I may have to start back in the past and then flash forward. So may have to do like a flashback chapter to get it started. So my current chapter one will be my future chapter two, and then I'll adjust the other chapters, the following chapters accordingly. So I'll probably have to do that to jump into it, just to give you sort of a book version of a jump scare right off the bat. So we'll see how that goes. But this is something different. I've never really written a horror story per se, but it just seemed like kind of a fun thing to do. So we'll see how that goes. But I definitely want to grab the reader right off the bat. Let's see. Yeah, I was where did I read that at? I think it was like an advice. It was like a I wish I had written down where I saw that. But it said that some people tend to skip the prologue, and they just want to jump right into the book. I think the idea was that the prologue is just kind of some backstory that you can kind of take it or leave it. But usually when I usually do read the prologue, generally speaking, or at least give it a try to see what it's all about. Um, Usually, if it's something that gives you a kind of a tease of what the story is going to be about, it's usually pretty interesting. But yeah, I'm gonna have to find that story and see if I can remember where I found that. So that's an interesting point, because I actually typically do read the prologue. Let me see if I can find something here. Hold on. Let's see. Trying to see if I can figure out where I saw that. Let's see. Let's try this one. I'll bring this one so we can read this one along with each other. Let's see what this. Hold on. Let me see. Okay, let me pull this up real quick. Hang on. This isn't the story. This isn't the one that I read, but let me pull this up real quick. So I'll let you guys read along with me here. I'm going to go to Writer's Digest. That's big enough for you guys to see. A little bit bigger, at least. All right, let's see. So, the great debate: to prologue or not to prologue. And this is looks like it's from 2017. It says, so this person tweets, act first, explain later. Great advice from James Scott Bell. Be careful with backstory and prologues. Let's see. Yes, prologues don't work all the time, do they? More often than not, I found myself skipping them. Love prologues and epilogues separate from chapters, but it appears that the general public does not. Wow, I didn't realize there was this. I'm with you, Nazy. I didn't realize that there was this much of a negative sentiment about prologue. This is just a random story that I found. Let's see, I think there was some more down here. Okay, so she gives a little bit of an explanation of what a prologue is. Prologues come before chapter one and could be expository, introductory prose, a poem, diary letter, news clipping, or anything in between. So those are, again, some strategies that you could use with a prologue. I think the Stephen King book Carrie is has a lot of newspaper articles that provide context for the story. As a reader, when I start reading a prologue, I'm usually impatient to get to chapter one, but by the end of a good prologue, I'm wondering about the subsequent story and excited to see how the event fits into the rest of the plot. That's a well-written prologue, mind you. The bad ones I skim over. So sometimes I skim, and if it sounds really good, then I'll, really get into it a little bit more. Let's see. I write prologues in my plays, but they are optional when it comes to staging the play. I usually make them fantastical, but always interesting to see what a director does with them. Yeah, I think I think if you're going to do a prologue, I would definitely make sure that it's not that it's grabbing. That's what I'm looking for, and the one that I'm thinking about doing is just making sure it really grabs a reader right off the bat. All right, let me continue with this a little bit, and I'll get back to some comments you guys are making. Okay. Okay, so here it is. Why such an immediately negative reaction? This is largely due to the poorly executed prologues littering query boxes and submission piles. Okay, I get that. Especially if you're a literary agent or a publisher, and you're probably getting a ton of stories that are submitted to you with varying levels of skill that a lot of which you probably don't want to deal with. So let's see. You'd be surprised how many writers commit the deadly sin of prologues. Wow, that's a little bit of a heavy-handed thought there. It's very, very interesting. Okay, prologue don'ts. Using a prologue as a place for a massive information dump. Absolutely, that's a good point. That's a totally fair point. Information dumping in general is just not a good thing. But using it in a prologue where people are apt to dismiss your story right off the bat is probably not a wise move. So no argument there. A boring prologue that readers want to skip to get to chapter one. I'd have to think that most people probably at least give a prologue a little bit of a chance. Let me see what. Let's see, one of you guys commented about prologues. That is very interesting. Says some deep mystery. I think if I could get into the prologue, I wouldn't just end up not reading the book. So yeah. So if you couldn't read it, yeah, I kind of agree with that. I think it could be. Usually, if I pick up a book, though, I'm highly interested in it. So, but a prologue can definitely send me into the book with maybe a not so good attitude. So I'm kind of with you there in that it could set a bad tone early on in the story and make me perhaps more apt to DNF a book if the prologue is boring, because then it makes you think, well, maybe the rest of it is going to be too. So good point there. So obviously, writing digest is coming from definitely much more of a writer's perspective. Look at your manuscript with critical eye of a reader and ask, would I skip the prologue and go right to chapter one? If so, consider what you do to spice things up a bit while keeping the prologue relevant to the story. That parenthetical is really a good point too, while keeping the prologue relevant to your story. I've read prologues that I feel like, why was that there? It was almost like they just threw something on there just for the sake of throwing it on there. Number three, things you shouldn't do, a prologue that has nothing to do with the story. So so that's exactly what I was just talking about right there. Number four, prologues that are too long. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, if it's too long, you just and it's, especially if it's boring, you're gonna just lose your readers right off the bat. Using the prologue to hook the readers as the sole purpose. Now, this is an interesting point here. Let me see. For this example, I'm thinking specifically of the prologues that throw the reader into the action, and I mean the middle of the action. Maybe it's the center of a bloody battlefield or twisted in the sheets of a love affair. Whatever it is, the reader is unceremoniously plunked into the action in a world they're unfamiliar with and whose characters they don't yet know and love. Okay? That's a good point. That's a good point. It's like you want to tease, but you don't want to like throw them into the middle of something that they don't understand and they have no reason to care about your characters. While action scenes are a gripping way to begin a story, consider whether or not this action is important to the central plot and if this beginning isn't too overwhelming, confusing for the reader to acclimate to. So, very good point there. Let's see. Easy says, The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead subtly and masterfully drops a major piece of info in the prologue. You don't realize it until the end of the book. Yeah, that's interesting you mentioned that book because I've been looking at that book and I keep coming across it when I'm looking through different online bookshops. And so I'm thinking about picking that one up. And I like the way you put it as to how Whitehead did that, by kind of planting a little seed there, a little bit of a clue of something that's going to happen later. That's a really good, that sounds like a very, very, very well done prologue there. All right, let's see. Let's continue with this article. Using the prologue strictly to provide atmosphere or to do some early on world building. World building is one of the things I love most about fantasy and science fiction. These delicious details are, well, delicious. The setting is described with enough detail to have the readers visualizing the character's surroundings, but not too much to bog down the pace of the scene. Proceed with caution if the prologue is used strictly to set the tone and introduce world-building elements. Often these details can be weaved into your chapters without the need of a prologue. Very, very good. However, like anything in this industry, the type of prologue or the inclusion-exclusion of them altogether are subjective, not to mention skilled writers have a way of proving the rules wrong. So when should prologue be utilized? In other words, when are they an asset to your story? Prologue should supply information that is or will be important to understanding the plot. This is what we're talking about with Nickel Boys. Often the prologue doesn't include the protagonist and takes place outside of the central plot, though not always. So anyway, that was an interesting story. Actually, it looks like there's a few more. So here we go. Types of prologues. So background history. So that's probably pretty self-explanatory. Different point of view. That's an interesting one. I don't think I've ever read a prologue with a different point of view. That's kind of interesting. As many of you know, debut authors are encouraged to minimize the number of rotating points of views in their manuscripts, capping out at a maximum of 6-ish. This type of prologue could be advantageous when diving into another character's perspective, particularly when the character's insight is only needed once and provides a foundation for the story. So protagonist past or future. Now, this is one I've seen before. Especially if it's after the event and the prologue is kind of the protagonist reflecting on a situation that impacted their lives. And so maybe they're talking about how their lives are now, and it leads into the first chapter of the story, the actual story. Strengths of a prologue: to provide a quick and dirty glimpse of important background information without the need of flashbacks, dialogue, or memories that can interrupt the action later on in the book. Number 2, to hook the reader into the action right away. Number 3, often information the reader couldn't otherwise glean from the plot, such as a break from the point of view narration or from a different character's perspective. Number 4, introduce the antagonist. Number 5, introduce a philosophy or religious belief important to the plot or setting. Number 6, foreshadow future events, thereby creating suspense for the reader and get them asking questions and eagerly reading on. Okay, next category, do I need a prologue? Number one, what information am I providing in the prologue? Why is it important to reveal it up front? Can it be revealed throughout the story in smaller trickles and still be impactful or more? Number two, does the character's point of view come up again later in the story? If so, would this work as a first chapter instead? That's one of the things I'm wrestling with. A first chapter that's maybe set back in time and then jump forward in chapter two. So that's something I'll have to wrestle with. So anyway, I think that is actually the end of the story. So that was something that I saw in there that I thought was kind of interesting. And since the topic came up, thought I would go ahead and mention that, and it ended up being a good article. So it really shows that I think that there are different reasons why you could and maybe could not use a prologue, and also the varying ways that you could use it and use it effectively so that you don't take away from your story. But I'm glad you mentioned the Nickel Boys, because that's definitely one that I'm looking at picking up at some point. So, okay, we are just past 1 hour together. Thank everybody who has been here. I am going to get the clock started here for another sprint because I'm ready to get back to some writing. So, hopefully, you guys have something to read nearby. Oh, wait a minute, I did miss a. Hold on, I missed the chat here. Hold on, let me see before I do that. What is the first draft of writing? I'm confused with it when authors say it. So first draft is like when you first start writing a story, you've outlined your story and you jump into it. And usually what you do is you try not to go back and edit when you're writing it for the first time. And so your first draft is you go through and you write the story. And you know it's going to be flawed. You know it's not going to be perfect, but you just go ahead and you just write it. Sometimes you write it really fast. Hopefully, if you have an outline, you stick to the outline and you get it done. So a lot of times when you do a first draft, like I did the NaNoWriMo story that I wrote in November that I mentioned a little bit earlier, I just went through it in the month of November, wrote it relatively fast. Actually, it took me about 6 weeks to write it. And I think it ended up being about 80,000 plus pages. So you just go through and you just write it. Then you come back later and you start to revise. And so you go through and you revise it the first time, and then that becomes your second draft, and then your third draft, and so on and so forth as you continue to edit. So hopefully that's a explanation that'll help. All right. Let me go ahead and start the Clizoc here, and we can get going. Okay, so I got in 163 words during that particular sprint. Hang on, let me do this real quick. Take that off the screen. Reset the clock. But before we really jump into that, I mentioned, and you can see it on the screen, that I'm going to talk about epilogues, because that's something that I haven't done. I haven't written an epilogue for a story since one of the first stories that I ever wrote when I was considerably younger and a lot less gray on my beard and a lot more hair on the top of my head. So, but I want to look at this article here. So let me pull it up right here real quick. Hang on. Pull this up. See, hopefully everybody can see that. So I can make a couple notches bigger here. So this is from masterclass.com. And this is by no means an endorsement of masterclass.com, though I do own a course off of masterclass.com that actually was really good. It was a James Patterson course, but that's another story for another day. All right, so it's discussing epilogues. So I think actually if I go up, let me see, I think it's got, go up and see if I can find the definition. Okay, let's go to the definition. The word epilogue comes from the Greek epilogos, which means conclusion word. It always comes at the end of a literary work and is therefore the opposite of a prologue, which always comes at the beginning. Makes sense. As with the prologue, the epilogue originated with Greek playwrights and poets. It served both as summary of the play's moral lessons as well as a wrap-up of the characters' fates. So that's typically what I see an epilogue being for, the second half of that, to wrap up the characters' fates. The tradition comes to Elizabethan times. So anyway, that's gives you kind of an idea of what it is. So typically when I've seen it, it's wrapping up what happens to a character down the line. Now, sometimes this can, as I mentioned in the comment section, this can kind of spoil it for me. If I have a vision for how things are going to play out with these characters, and then you kind of force it on me with an epilogue, that can sometimes destroy it and maybe spoil the ending just a little bit. Okay, let's go back to where we were. Oh, sorry, I think I just passed it right there. Here we go. Yeah, this is where I was. Sorry. Okay, 3 things a good epilogue should do. The necessity of an epilogue is a subject of much debate. The general advice is to only use it if you absolutely have to. In other words, don't use it in place of a solid and satisfying ending. As with a prologue, the epilogue should only contain information that is absolutely vital to the main story. Furthermore, it should supplement a reader's understanding of what has transpired and provide a strong resolution. Number 1, adds to the development of character by telling readers what happened to them after the story has ended. If you've written a compelling story, readers will be invested in your characters and their fates. An epilogue is a nice way to let your readers know that what happened to your characters after the story has ended, particularly if the end of the book is ambiguous in any way. That's a good point. If an ending is ambiguous, that does make sense. It can also be a chance for you to show how the events of the entire story impacted the characters, the lessons they learned, and how they have grown. So good point. Again, good point about the ambiguous ending. Number 2, sets up the possibility of a sequel. If you're planning a sequel or series of novels, an epilogue is a nice way to let readers know they haven't heard the last of these characters. Some epilogues simply hint at the next installment. Others can actually introduce a twist or cliffhanger to make readers instantly crave the next part of the story. However, cliffhangers are tricky to set up. They can't simply come out of nowhere. A good cliffhanger epilogue will nod to things that readers already know about and have possibly even seen coming. And lastly, number 3 reiterates the importance of what the story is trying to say. An epilogue can be a good way to remind readers of the central themes and lessons of your story. Since an epilogue is its own standalone short section, you can play around with the structure to highlight some of the things you want readers to take away with them. So there are uses for an epilogue. Let's see. Here's some examples. 5 examples of famous epilogues. The Hunger Games, Catching Fire, 2009. Yeah, I hadn't thought about it like that. That's a good point. Gosh, Moby Dick is one I haven't actually read. That's a classic that I haven't read. I haven't even thought about that one as a classic. Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. Animal Farm by George Orwell. That's a good one. Never read Harry Potter. I actually have 2 Harry Potter books. I have the first one and the last one. I've never read either one of them. The first one I got was a gift for Christmas. And the last one I got, I was going through a big box department store, and there were display boxes like every 2 feet. So I ended up buying one since everybody was buying one. So I did pick up one. All right, so how to write an epilogue in 4 steps. Set the epilogue in the future. Provide space between the action of your final formal chapter and action or commentary of your epilogue. The passage of time provides gravitas to the statements you will make in this section. Number 2, reveal information that hasn't previously been provided. That's a good point. Number 3, offer a point of view that wasn't represented in your main narrative. Number 4, tee up a future narrative. So anyway, some good pieces of advice. I thought that was kind of an interesting story and an interesting topic to get into the epilogue. Let's see. I don't mind an ambiguous ending if it's done well. An epilogue can ruin that for me. That's a good point. That's a good point. I think an ambiguous ending where you leave the reader to use their imagination, I think is a good thing. It's definitely not always a bad thing. And if you have an epilogue that tells you what you're supposed to think or forces a conclusion on you that the writer had, but you might not have after reading it with a fresh perspective, then I think that can be a not so positive thing as well. So good point. Very, very good point with that. I'm trying to think the one story that I wrote many years ago that had an epilogue. I didn't think it had. I don't recall it having an overly ambiguous ending. It was one of those things where I probably had seen it in a story, and it was like, oh, so and so went on to do this and become a star. It was like if you remember the movie Animal House. In Animal House, they tell you what happens to each of the characters at the end of the story after the story is over, and they do it in to some degree. It was in comic fashion to just kind of give you a little fun at the end of the story. So I'd probably seen a movie or something along those lines, or maybe read a book along those lines that made me think about doing an epilogue. So that's kind of how that can work sometimes. So. All right. Well, I'm going to get ready to check out here for the day. I have had a really good time and appreciate everybody who was able to come through and join me here for this sprint here. And that was a good time. I really enjoyed it. I haven't been on here quite as much lately just because I've had a lot of things going on, and I have some things actually going on later today. But I wanted to jump on here between breakfast and some work that I'm going to be doing later today. So I thought it would be kind of fun to get in some writing as well, because I haven't really been doing enough writing, and I need to get back to that. But I also need to get back to my reading. So definitely going to make sure that Concrete Rose is finished by the end of the weekend, so I can knock this one out, because I've got some really good books that I still want to read yet this month. It is January the 23rd. So I'm running out a month, and I'm at 6 books already. And I think 4 of them I just smashed out in like the first week of January. So I have clearly stalled a little bit on the last 2 books, but they've been good books. They've been books that I've definitely enjoyed. If you remember, I was reading Black Buck, the book that I think I got it from Book of the Month. So it came a little bit later in January. So I read that, and that was a good read. And now I'm reading, of course, Concrete Rose. So that's how it's going right now. I'm looking forward to finishing that one and then getting into other books here as I move ahead. So I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you all for joining me, and I look forward to being back on here about the same time tomorrow. So if you want to join me tomorrow morning, you are more than welcome to come through and participate. So hopefully I'll see you guys tomorrow. Thanks again to everybody, and everybody